Okay, so as I mentioned before we left the last time, there is on page 649 this 10-point program for socialization that Marx lays out in the manifesto on page 649. Number one of which is abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. Bearing in mind that land is the single largest proportion of things that are capital, that are things that are either wealth in their own or can be used to create wealth. So there is the immediate use of land and rents on land in order to fund the state. Second, a heavy progressive and graduated income tax. And here again, remember that a progressive income tax is a tax that gets larger as a percentage of income as income gets greater. Third, the abolition of all right of inheritance. So when a person dies, rather than his or her property going to the children, it goes to the state. Fourth, confiscation of the property of all emigrants and rebels. In the event that there is a communist takeover, Marx says that what should be done is that the property of those people who leave should have their property confiscated. Number five, centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. So a central bank with no competition from other banks. 7, extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, the bringing into cultivation of wastelands, and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. So there is here the expression of the desire for a broad economic planning for the state at the central level, with the instruments of production brought under that state's control. So any privately operating enterprises would be nationalized and brought under the control of the government. And that would include farming. Number 8, equal liability of all to labor, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. So one of the underlying principles of communism is to each according to his need, from each according to his ability. Right, so the state will take care of you if you are not able to take care of yourself, but the expectation is that if you can contribute to the process of the economy operating under socialist control, then you are required to do so. And again, this goes especially with regard to agriculture. Number 9, combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country, by a more equitable distribution of the population over the country. So Marx wants to see de-urbanization, remembering that he sees urbanization as an outcome of capitalism, particularly the eradication of smaller towns and villages. Last but not least, free education for all in public schools, abolition of children's factory labor in its present form, combination of education with industrial production, etc. So these are the things that Marx says would need to be done pretty much immediately. The complete abolition of private property in terms of it being, remember, private ownership of capital would eventually come, but in terms of the state gaining control of these things, of the most important things, these are the ones that he puts at the top of the list. Now, by the way, many of these we have in the United States. We have a progressive or graduated income tax. It is true that in the United States, the more money you make, the greater percentage you pay of your income in taxation. It's also true that that we confiscate the property of immigrants and rebels, or at least of rebels. We don't confiscate the property of immigrants, but many countries do put restrictions. Countries that we would consider to be perfectly free countries put restrictions on the ability of people to leave a country and take all of their property with them at once. We have in the past centralized our banking, and we currently have a system that is sort of quasi-federally centralized through the Federal Reserve. but we haven't eliminated competition with by other banks. And of course, we have public education in the United States. So if we have, say, 3.5 of these 10 things, are we well on the road to communism in the United States? And if not, then why not? So it's a matter, to some extent, of understanding that just because it's something that communists say is good doesn't mean that it is something that only communists say is good, right? Remember the example of Hitler and divided highways. We have divided highways in the United States. It doesn't mean that everybody that works for the Department of Transportation is a Nazi. It just means that they also agree that divided highways are a good idea. Why do people support, for instance, free education for all children in public schools? Well, it is, there's a couple of reasons. The first of which is that there is a general kind of philosophical position that it is the duty of a country to provide an education for its children so that everybody that finishes their education starts out in their professional life on a relatively even playing field. They are also very, public schools are a very efficient means of ideologizing, giving ideology to children and having them believe it, right? They spend 10 months a year, 9 months a year, 5 days a week in school. They can be taught lessons in citizenship. Depending on how ideologically totalitarian that state is, it might completely brainwash those children. But certainly, it plays some role in instilling a sense of citizenship to have public schools. So these are the conditions. Now, one of the questions that comes up in discussing these points as well as the overall sort of process in general is, well, how would Marxist revolutionaries, upon seizing control of the means of production, or at the very least seizing control of the state apparatus, right? Because if we think about it in terms of a process, a revolution can happen and the government can be in the hands of a revolutionary group, but that doesn't mean necessarily they've gained control over all of the aspects of that state. They might just have control over, say, the military, and therefore have military power, but they might not be able to wield, economic power, or for that matter, ideological power. So how does this process happen? Well, Marx says that there are 5 stages that encompass this. And the first one is the revolution itself. It's necessary to smash the current system of political power and establish political power with the underlying necessary military power in order to begin the process rolling. And the second and most important thing that Marx says is part of this process is what's called a dictatorship of the proletariat. Right? So the proletariat are the wage laboring people, the working class, and now they have seized control of the state. They will rule by decree, as a dictatorship will do. This is not considered by sort of orthodox Marxists to be a permanent situation, but rather one whose goal it is to accomplish the third thing on the list, which is the redistribution of wealth. Right? So if the goal of socialism is to effect greater equality among the people within a society, or at the very least to address the issue of inequality, then with the underlying economic understanding of Marxism and the way that it addresses economic inequality, wealth redistribution is part of that. And so these things that are on this list, particularly those ones that involve the transfer of property from private hands to public hands, to government hands, are things that would be done by a dictatorship of the proletariat. That doesn't mean that there's no other form of government, by the way. It just means that on the highest level, with the most important role, according to Marx, of this wealth redistribution, that would be done by this dictatorship of the proletariat. And it needs to be a dictatorship because clearly there are going to be problems that certain people are going to have with this process as it unfolds. With the redistribution of wealth by the dictatorship of the proletariat, Marx says, the distinction between classes will disappear, which is kind of self-evident if you think about it. And this is an important sort of historical moment from Marx's standpoint, because at this point, essentially, the entire driver of class history up until this point is gone. If all of human history, as he says at the beginning of the manifesto, can be understood as the history of class conflict, then when you eradicate class conflict through the implementation of socialism, then you emerge into something entirely new. And if, as he maintains further in the manifesto, the purpose of government by and large, particularly since the advent of industrial capitalism, is to maintain the conditions that are favorable to industrial capitalism, and this form of capitalism in particular fuels wealth inequality to the extent that it does, which is to say the greatest extent ever, then the need for government will disappear when when inequality of wealth has been eradicated. And so the final stage of this, and this is really what communism is in the strictest sense of the term, communism is the end goal at which wealth having been redistributed and equality having been achieved, government is no longer necessary, and a kind of utopian existence emerges where everybody gets along. Now, we call it utopian because it's in part at least, because it's not terribly realistic and we've never actually seen it before. But it's important to concede to Marx that if you believe, it's a big if, but if you believe that class conflict is the only thing that drives conflict, then eradicating class will eradicate conflict. It's a very easy conclusion to draw from the premises, provided that you believe the premises. So this leaves one final question to consider before we move on from this, which is that, well, so here's one thing that we've noticed about communism when it has been put into practice. And that's not to say that communism, in terms of the end goal, this utopian classless society, has been achieved, because it is not. But at least this process of revolution and then a dictatorship of the proletariat and wealth redistribution, these first three have been done repeatedly. And so the question is, well, why don't we ever get to 4 and 5? Why, in fact, has every attempt to do this on a national scale historically, why has it stagnated at step number 2, basically? Yeah.
Those in charge of step 3 don't distribute the wealth equally?
Well, so there's the issue of corruption, which would be part of that, right? So there's the charge that's made, and it's often a very valid charge, that those people who constitute the dictatorship of the proletariat and whose job it is to redistribute wealth don't do so fairly, that they apportion more to themselves, that there is a process by which maybe favors are doled out, or patronage is recognized, or things like that happen. And certainly we can recognize that those things have happened pretty much in every case. What else? Yeah.
So like wages would differ among professions. So like, for example, like a doctor would get the same wages like someone who's in the lower class.
So let's assume for a moment that that's true. I can't confirm or deny. But let's assume let's assume, because ultimately the end stage would be a situation in which that is largely true, which is to say that anybody's income would just be commensurate with what they need rather than what they want, right? So if there's less money to be gotten by a person from becoming a doctor, why is that something that stands in the way of this process coming to culmination? Yeah.
People lose the motivation.
Well, so certainly there's an argument to be made that from an economic standpoint, if we accept the the proposition that people respond to incentives and that better incentives in terms of income are going to have people respond better and more efficiently and with higher performance. And by the way, everything about economics that we know suggests that that's true. Then there's no reason to think that, that at the very least there wouldn't be economic stagnation, which again is something that we've seen in every single one of these cases. Although whether we can chalk that up entirely to the matter of lack of incentive or to the fact that there is a highly regulated market rather than a deregulated market that would be much more efficient, it's hard to say, yeah.
Wouldn't that cause an incentive, though, to revolt against the government at that point?
Well, certainly it would, right? Which would require then the use of force in order to put that rebellion down. And this has happened repeatedly as well. And there are specific cases to talk about, but I mean, in the very specific case of Eastern Europe following World War II, where the Soviet Union imposed all of these governments on Eastern European countries that were communist and that sought to implement a system like this, there were uprisings in virtually every country. In Eastern Europe in the 50s, in Hungary in the 50s, in Czechoslovakia in the 60s, in Poland in the late 70s. And these were largely worker uprisings on the basis of their needs not being met, and their demands not being met by a government that claimed to represent the workers. Now, the reasons for all of that are highly complex and vary to some extent from place to place. But that's another thing that sort of came up in all of these places, yeah.
Is it because class distinctions make a society run?
Well, there's the argument to be made for that as well, right? I mean, capitalism, for one thing, as a system, is a system that will always result in a hierarchy of some kind because there's always going to be winners and there's always going to be losers, right? That's the nature of competition. The promise of capitalism at the same time is that any person that begins the game as a loser can be a winner, right? And so there is something to be said for that notion, but there's also something to be said for the opposite notion, which is to say that capitalism has not necessarily delivered on the promise that there's the potential for any person to become, particularly if you put it in Marxist terms, for any proletarian to become a member of the bourgeoisie. In fact, it's extraordinarily rare. If you look at just the concentration of wealth in the United States today, it's held by an extraordinarily small number of people, the vast majority of whom got that wealth by inheriting it. The people that didn't are people that were basically genius entrepreneurs like Bill Gates, who did not grow up wealthy and did not inherit a lot of money, but certainly his children will. But the rest of them, like the Koch brothers and the Walton family and the Rockefeller family and everybody else, that's money that's 50 to 100 years old that was left down generation to generation. And Marx would argue in a country that does not have, at the very least, a very high inheritance tax, it's going to be very difficult to make up for that level of inequality. But back to the point, if there is something inherent within one economic system of a hierarchy being emergent in the first place, then follow through with that for me. So why would the absence of that be a detriment? Where's the sort of the sticking point?
So the working class helps the society continue forward.
Right.
There's work that has to get done, and alongside the incentive, equal wages doesn't really incentivize anybody to do more or less work.
Right. I mean, so it's the point that Caroline made, just stated slightly differently, right? I mean, it's a matter of incentives, and yeah, I mean that's definitely true, right? I mean, we can recognize that, as well as the fact that there is this sort of broadly recognized notion that regardless of the economic system that you have in place, just on the basis of individual ability and individual people's desires for the kind of work they want to do, so on and so forth, they're going to end up in different places on a class scale anyway. What's up? One last point about this is that another big reason why it stagnates at the dictatorship of the proletariat is because virtually never do dictators give up their power voluntarily. The greater the amount of power that's endowed into the hands of a person or a small group, the less likely it is that that person or small group is going to relinquish that power without a fight. Power has a tendency to want to sustain itself, right? This goes back to Plato. When a government is in pursuit of power as its sort of end goal, it has the effect of not only making that government belligerent, but also making that government incompetent, or at least being related to that government's incompetence. And so, and all of these are sort of contributing explanations for why the process didn't work. I would suggest that there's one final reason for why the process doesn't work. And that is that there was repeatedly in all of these cases a very serious international response that sought to discourage or prevent this process from unfolding, which is not to say that without that pressure it would have unfolded perfectly with no problems. We can pretty much be assured that that is also not true. But it was, particularly in the case of the Soviet Union in the early years, that was very much the case. And so that's an important thing to bear in mind. So I want to move forward from this point, but before I do, are there any questions about any of the stuff covered in the section on Marx? Okay. So as you might be aware, the first place where this is tried is in Russia, which is unusual because Marx says that a precondition for a socialist revolution is an industrial bourgeoisie and a highly industrialized economy that produces immense profit, which Russia did not have. Russia was still immensely, overwhelmingly agrarian before the communists took over in 1917. It was on its way to industrializing, but it was not well down that path. In Russia proper, which is to say, not including the areas that are now their own independent countries, Ukraine, Belarus, so on and so forth, which have their own large cities, Russia basically just had two big cities, St. Petersburg and Moscow, and both of those cities were pretty well industrialized, but the rest of the country was not. So it was, first of all, relatively surprising to everybody that it happened this way. The other thing is that Russia was still an absolute monarchy at the turn of the 20th century. So the monarch in Russia, the Tsar, was still, for instance, the head of the state church. The Russian Orthodox Church still wielded tremendous executive power. There was no popularly elected legislative body in Russia. So as a result of losing a war to Japan, there is a revolution that breaks out in Russia in 1905. And this has the result of some short-term reforms. There is, for instance, a popularly elected legislature that is instituted called the Duma. And they create a position of prime minister whose job it is to head the legislative branch of government. But once the revolution subsides in terms of its fervency, the reform is pretty much rolled back, and the prime minister becomes more or less an advisor to the Tsar rather than somebody who shares power equally or even concurrently with the Tsar. But what does happen is that there's the creation of political parties, and one of these political parties is this party that emerges that's known as the Bolsheviks. So the Bolsheviks begin as a party called the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. And social democracy is this ideology, this socialistic, if not exactly socialist ideology that emerges mainly in Germany in the late 19th century. It is a policy that seeks to implement socialism through democratic means, so it's a democratic socialist movement. But within that party in Russia, as well as within other countries, but we're most importantly in Russia, relevant to our discussion of this, there are Marxist factions that arise as well that are seeking to establish power through revolution. And the Marxist faction within the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party is the Bolshevik Party. The man that leads it is a man named Vladimir Lenin. In the aftermath of the 1905 revolution, which is not led in any significant way by the Bolsheviks, they're just sort of biding their time at this point. But in the aftermath, Marxists at large basically are arrested. Lenin among them. They are arrested, jailed for a certain period of time, and then sent into exile. Lenin, for his own part, goes to Zurich in Switzerland. So Lenin himself, I mentioned this point in the last class. He's born into a middle-class family, and that's actually elevated into nobility before he's an adult. And he himself is inspired largely to his own revolutionary activity by the activities of his brother Alexander, who is arrested for conspiring to assassinate the Tsar and is executed for having done so. Same year that his brother is executed, Vladimir Lenin enters, whose last name, by the way, is Ulyanov. He begins university and begins to associate with more ideologically oriented revolutionaries, fellow Marxists. And so when he finishes school, he goes to St. Petersburg, the imperial capital in Russia, and begins political organizing. He's arrested for the first time in 1897 and is exiled to Siberia. And it is at that point that he adopts the pseudonym Lenin, which he uses then for the rest of his life. And it is before the 1905 revolution that Lenin writes this book called What Is to Be Done. And actually, if you turn in your book to page 711, I want to take a brief look at this. But we will, we'll get to that in a minute. So this 1905 revolution in Russia fails. And the next sort of big event for Russia is that it enters World War I with the UK and France against Germany, the Ottoman Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But Russia is poorly equipped to fight this war. Its army is not up to the caliber of the German army, and so it loses significant ground. There are widespread mutinies in the army, and all of this culminates in another revolution that happens in March of 1917. This revolution is a lot more successful. The monarchy is abolished, and a provisional democratic government is established, eventually under a man whose name is Alexander Kerensky, who is from one of the socialist parties. And multiple parties participate in this government, including there's at that point 3 socialist parties. All of them participate to some extent. There are also democratic parties, there are monarchist parties, there are sort of more conservative parties, but it is a multi-party democracy that begins operating in Russia in the spring of 1917. The big problem with the Kerensky government is that it will not exit the war. Despite the war clearly being the problem that brought down the Tsar's government, Kerensky and his government are convinced that the war needs to keep going. And it is at this point that the Germans, who are looking to get Russia out of the war because the Americans are going to be arriving soon, and Germany knows that they're going to need to put all of their manpower on the Western Front, it's at that point that German intelligence goes and finds Lenin in Zurich, puts him on a sealed railway car, and sends him back to Russia to overthrow the government. He gets back there in April, and after a series of upheavals, showdowns with the government, an attempted military coup that fails, largely as a result of the Bolsheviks opposing it, there is finally a showdown that emerges between Kerensky's government and the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks have their base of power in workers' councils, which are these sort of ad hoc conglomerates of workers' representatives who are seeking to establish political power on the basis of what the workers directly want. Whereas Kerensky's base of power is are the other political parties who support his government and who are seeking to establish a long-term parliamentary democracy. And this is the breakdown of power in the summer of 1917 until the point at which Lenin and the rest of the Bolsheviks feel that it is, they have sufficient power within the workers' councils to overthrow Kerensky's government, which they do on November 7th, 1917. They overthrow the government, they seize the bases of power, they have enough support in the military to get the military support, with the exception of some segments of the officers' corps, who then launch a civil war against the government. So Lenin seizes control of Russia in November of 1917, and he sets to getting out of the war, which he does. But now he has this civil war to fight, and the people against whom he's fighting in the civil war are they're being spurred on by essentially the rest of the world, who are deeply concerned about the possibility of communist revolutionaries taking over in their own countries. As noted, this war lasts for 5 years. It's tremendously destructive, not in the least to the economy in Russia, because, among other things, not only is the infrastructure destroyed by the war itself, but in order to feed the troops that are fighting the war, it's necessary for the Bolsheviks to requisition enormous amounts of food from the peasants, who hate that, because, after all, they would prefer to feed themselves. So there's widespread starvation. There's deep resentment on the part of the peasants toward the Bolsheviks, so that when the Civil War finally ends in around 1922, the Bolsheviks are the only party left standing, but they've got a real mess on their hands. The economy is essentially ruined, and their base of support outside of the cities is pretty much nil. So almost immediately after the war ends, Lenin institutes something called the New Economic Policy, which basically begins to allow some limited amount of capitalism to operate within, particularly within rural areas. So that, for instance, peasants can now sell their surplus grain on the free market and make a profit at doing that. The argument goes that essentially the only way, and it's a rather large concession for Marxist socialists to make, is that really the only way for economic recovery to happen in the countryside in Russia will be for capitalism to do it. And that at some later point, then it will be possible to return to a more socialist model. But for at least the next couple of years, it's never really clearly stated, which is part of the which partly explains what follows after Lenin dies. It's never made entirely clear how long they intend to keep this policy in place. But there is an economic recovery that comes along with it, which is important. And it's actually that economic recovery that manages to prevent the Bolsheviks from losing power. So in terms of what is to be done, it is Lenin's enunciation of an ideology that comes to be called Marxism-Leninism, or just Leninism, which is Lenin's sort of own variation on orthodox Marxism. And basically, the idea that he comes up with is the idea of what is called a vanguard, a party vanguard. So we talked about this a little bit last time, this idea about how Marx says in the Communist Manifesto that that an organized proletariat can only push the conflict between classes so far because it lacks a coherent political ideology that offers a program to implement upon the seizure of power. And Marx says that it's really only educated people that can provide that, but because the proletariat doesn't have access to education, doesn't have any money, it's necessary for sympathetic members of the bourgeoisie to join the proletariat in that struggle, to provide that ideology, and thereby to direct the revolution in a socialist direction. What Lenin formulates in what is to be done is how that process should unfold. So he says, and in particular, he lays this out on page 712, the second full paragraph on that page. He says, I assert, one, that no revolutionary movement can endure without a stable organization of leaders maintaining continuity. That just continuity just means, you know, that the movement can't be decapitated, right? One of the most effective ways to neutralize any political movement is to get rid of the leadership. If you can get rid of the leadership, then you have eliminated the ability of the rank and file to be led. And so one of the things that a party vanguard does is assure that that can't happen. And it does that basically by implementing high levels of secrecy, the use of pseudonyms, so that when rank and file members are tortured, they can't give up actual people, they can only give up pseudonyms, right? Who told you to do this? Lenin told me to do this. Well, who's Lenin? Well, I don't know. He's the guy with the beard and the bald head. Where does he live? I don't know, right? I mean, it operates on essentially the same model that the mafia does, which is to say that what never happens in the mafia is the boss of the family giving an order to some guy on the street to shoot somebody. And that exists for a couple of reasons. First of all, to provide plausible deniability, so that people can literally go into court and not be lying when they say this guy did not tell me to do this, or I did not tell this guy to do this, right? But the other thing is that so that people can't be given up in situations in which pressure is being put on them to confess. So there's that aspect of it. Second, that the broader of the popular mass drawn spontaneously into the struggle, which forms the basis of the movement and participates in it, the more urgent the need for such an organization and the more solid this organization must be. For it is much easier for all sorts of demagogues to sidetrack the more backward sections of the masses. So the bigger and more spontaneous an outbreaking of popular unrest is, the more great the need is for a party vanguard. Third, that such an organization must consist chiefly of people engaged professionally in revolutionary activity. So you, the rank and file, you might be, you might work in a mill, and you might work in a factory, and you might, work on a farm. But Lenin's job and the people around Lenin, their job is going to be only to plan and carry out the revolution. Fourth, that in an autocratic state, the more we confine the membership of such an organization to people who are professionally engaged in revolutionary activity and who have been professionally trained in the art of combating the political police, the more difficult the more difficult will it be to unearth the organization. Basically covered that already, but if you have hardcore ideologues at the center, they're going to be far less likely to turn on each other. And that group, therefore, has to be insulated from the rank and file as much as possible. Fifth and finally, the greater will be the number of people from the working class and other social classes who will be able to join the movement and perform active work in it. So this is the sort of the clear enunciation of how this should work. It recognizes a principle laid down by Marx in the Communist Manifesto, but it concretizes it and it makes it sort of plain in terms of plainer, I should say, in terms of the language that it uses and the roles that people play. there is an inherent contradiction that arises in an ideology like Leninism. And it's this. If it is an ideology that seeks to accomplish greater equality through the eradication of the unequal distribution of wealth, then why does it rely on such an unequal distribution of power in its organization? Is it not committed to the same principles that it claims to be seeking to accomplish? Which, by the way, was the immediate critique that was made of this by other people who were Marxists who didn't agree with what he was stating. Lenin's response to that was to basically say that they were being childish, that they were not being realistic in terms of understanding the way the world really works. Because it worked, because it is, after all, a pretty effective way to run an organization. If you insulate the leadership from the rank and file, and you concentrate power in the hands of that central organization that is ideologically committed, the possibility of the organization being betrayed is significantly less. And in a situation operating with an environment that employs secret police, as the Tsarist Russia definitely did, then that becomes an even greater necessity. Because it worked, it's the model that other revolutionary organizations picked up. And that was not just left-wing revolutionary organizations, it was right-wing revolutionary organizations, including nationalist organizations, as we'll see when we talk about nationalism. Now, as already pointed out, Lenin wins in this struggle to seize power in Russia, and he wins in the Civil War. But in winning in the Civil War, he has to make concessions to capitalism. He also has to sort of violate the very principles that he's laid out in the first place. When the Bolsheviks are trying to evade the Tsarist secret police, the secret police are the enemy, but when Lenin is seeking to requisition grain from the peasants, or to eradicate their own enemies in the context of the Civil War, he's more than happy to then create his own secret police force. When he is not holding power, he sees fit to agitate for the election of a democratic body to govern, but once the Bolsheviks seize power, and that election is held and the Bolsheviks don't win it, he dissolves that body and they rule by decree from that point forward. Now, Lenin also makes some very large errors after the dust settles in the Civil War. So the Civil War ends in 1922. Lenin dies 2 years later. And he's debilitated for at least half of that time by a series of strokes that he has. And the result of this is that there is a power struggle that follows after Lenin dies. And because Lenin has not clearly enough stated his desires for how things will proceed after he dies, this power struggle shapes the way that the nation develops over the course of the next several decades. As already pointed out, for one thing, Lenin's never indicated how long the new economic policy is supposed to go on, so that's a point of contention immediately. And the second thing is that there is a disagreement within the party on the matter of spreading the revolution. And so the main parties in this fight, this power struggle that emerges after Lenin dies, are Leon Trotsky, who has been the Minister for War and the Minister for Foreign Affairs. And Trotsky is a proponent of something called permanent revolution. Trotsky believes that it should be the goal of Soviet Russia and subsequently the USSR to foment revolution throughout the industrialized world, beginning first in the rest of Europe and then hopefully in the rest of the world. The other thing about Trotsky is that because he is very much a committed Marxist and very far to the left, he is against the new economic policy and wants to get rid of it. So for him, it's immediate socialization, spread the revolution everywhere. The person whom he has to fight against, for the most part, is Joseph Stalin. Stalin is the General Secretary of the Communist Party, which is in a really important bureaucratic position, which has allowed him to sort of very quietly but very consistently amass a lot of personal power. He is the proponent of a policy called socialism in one country. Stalin makes the argument that Russia is still too weak, and it needs to accomplish socialism on its own, which it has not yet done, because for one thing, the country is still not industrialized. So we should forget, for the time being, trying to inspire revolutions elsewhere. We need to focus on Russia. And the second thing is that, at least in the short term, he is in favor of the new economic policy. But really what Stalin does is use the new economic policy as a chip to position himself against his enemies. Now, you're probably aware Stalin won this fight. It takes about 5 years, but by the time the smoke clears on that one, Stalin has eliminated basically all the ideological opponents he has within the party. He's now the most powerful person in the Soviet Union. And he can set about to implementing his own set of policies. And so after getting rid of the opposition, he then gets rid of the new economic policy and begins a policy of sort of industrialization on steroids and collectivization of farming. So he decides basically that the only way that Russia can become a truly socialist economy is to be first an industrial economy, and to do that is going to require just plowing forward and getting rid of any opposition along the way. So in the late 20s and early 30s, this will be the single bloodiest period in the history of the Soviet Union, because it will be during this period that whole classes of people will be liquidated on the basis of their position that they've accrued during the new economic policy, right? You've got the new economic policy that allows peasants to make a little bit of money, to accrue some amount of personal wealth. Now Stalin is going to turn on those people and take their land and kill a lot of them in the process. In Ukraine, where the sort of the breadbasket for the Soviet Union is, this will take on truly genocidal proportions. The Ukrainians will be resistant to collectivization because they have the greatest stakes in their farms. They are also much more highly nationalistic than a lot of the other national minorities in the Soviet Union, and so they resist being Russified, being forced to speak Russian, being forced to take on Soviet rule, generally speaking. So they resist collectivization of their farms. Stalin's response to this is to requisition their grain and leave nothing for them to eat. And the result of this is that literally millions of people starve in a famine that is completely engineered on Stalin's part. There is, in fact, a shortage of food, but, and just to be clear on a point of distinction, drought versus famine, right? So drought is bad for farming societies. If there's not enough rain, there's not going to be enough crops, right? And that's something that's periodic, that happens in a lot of countries, and that can have bad consequences. Famine is one possible outcome of drought. It is not the only possible outcome of drought. It requires human mismanagement of drought to get famine. In the case of Stalin with the Ukraine, it wasn't even a matter of mismanagement. It was just deliberate starvation to break the resistance of of the Ukrainians. This is called in Ukrainian Holodomor, which means basically murder by starvation. Now, one of the things that that history of the Soviet Union under Stalin teaches us is that you can accomplish anything if you don't care how many people get hurt, right? So, I mean, Stalin sets out to industrialize the Soviet Union inside of 5 years, and he does it, which is a pretty remarkable accomplishment if you overlook the great big pile of bodies, right? He turns the Soviet Union into a world power. But it is at tremendous human cost. And this is something that we'll see emerging sort of over and over again in the history of applied communist rule in the 20th century. Then, in his sort of next great turn in the 1930s, after really having already successfully eliminated his political opposition, he then turns to purge the Communist Party of any perceived enemies that might be left. And so over the course of the next 4 years, former political enemies who have long been neutralized are now arrested again, are put on trial, and are executed, after first being made to confess to things that are outlandish and largely impossible. In this stage, another 1 million people, perhaps as many as 1 million, it's not really clear, are killed. And in the final stage of the purge, even the officer corps in the army is purged, which is bad news for Russia because they are going to need that military pretty soon. Last but not least, of Stalin's great achievements as leader of the Soviet Union is that he then intervenes in the Spanish Civil War. Civil War breaks out in Spain in 1936. There is a socialist government elected. In response to that, the army, led by nationalist elements within it, launches basically a revolution to overthrow the democratically elected government. Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy support the nationalist side. The Soviet Union supports the socialist side. And so it becomes sort of a proxy war for what's to come in World War II. George Orwell makes the argument in his book about the Spanish Civil War, Homage to Catalonia, he makes the argument that the war was lost basically because rather than committing to winning the war, Stalin instead just extended the purges of the party that were already going on to Spain and eliminated opposition to Stalinism in Spain rather than eliminating the nationalist element. So all in all, not a great record, although, as noted, he does successfully nationalize or industrialize the country. We will we'll return to Stalin when we talk about the Nazis, because it's where they enter the picture that it gets a little bit more difficult for him. Any questions about any of that stuff? Stalin, I should just point out, is a very extreme example of what power can do to a person. It is often argued that Stalin was the result of just merely the implementation of communism, and it's difficult to make that argument in the absence of numerous other Stalins. He was kind of a unique monster in a particular regard. And probably after 1934, when he begins this whole matter of purging the party and just sort of lashing out at anybody that looks at him funny, probably not all there as well. Although sadly for Russia, he rules for 20 years after the purges begin. So it's not really great for anybody under Stalin. It's one of those states where you really have to be afraid all of the time because there's no logic to the way that the government can lash out at you. there's often comparisons that are made between the Soviet Union under Stalin and Nazi Germany, both totalitarian states, both pervasive ideologies, both dictators who are extremely violent, right? If you weren't Jewish and you didn't express an adverse political position in Nazi Germany, you were probably going to be okay until the war started. When the war started, then all bets were off, right? Because your country got flattened and a lot of civilians got killed. But if you weren't Jewish and you weren't politically active and you just kept your head down, you were probably going to be fine. In the Soviet Union, that was just not the case. At least under Stalin, it was not a situation where you could sort of relax. You don't get that a lot, really. The most recent examples that we have of that are like Iraq under Saddam Hussein and North Korea today, basically. But not a lot of other states operate on that level with that kind of pervasive reach of the government into every single aspect of life. So the last thing to discuss in discussing socialism and its implementation in the form of communism is China. So China has its own national revolution in 1911. It's called the Qinghai Revolution. It is led by Dr. Sun Yat-sen, who is a Western-educated medical doctor. Between the 17th century and 1911, China is actually run by an external empire, by people called the Manchus, who come from what's now northeast China and are not members of the majority Han ethnic group within China. So it's actually sort of governed by outsiders. And as a result of Dr. Sun Yat-sen's revolution, republic is founded, the monarchy is abolished, the Manchu rule is abolished, and sort of modern China emerges from this process. The problem is that Sun doesn't hang on for very long, and once he's gone, the ability for the country to move forward under a kind of centralized rule as a republic falters badly. For one thing, there's a lot of diffuse military power in the country. It's a big country, remember, for one thing, and it's always been ruled by warlords who operated on a local basis. The government, under the First Republican government, was unable to bring those warlords under central control, and so when that government faltered, the warlords reasserted their control. And the problem with government by warlords is that they operate mainly on extensive patronage networks, and so they're always looking to repay favors and line their pockets and things like that, rather than sort of looking out for the overall well-being of the people that are at least nominally under their care. And this is a big deal in China because in China, starvation is a regular event. It's one of the first countries in the world to establish agriculture, but with a combination of its climate and the just enormous population, as well as the lack of industrial development to move that food from place to place, starvation and millions of people dying as a result of famine is a regular occurrence. Happens every 25 to 40 years in China over its modern history. And it happens twice while the country is being run by the warlords. So, sort of in response to this crisis of starvation in the country, the lack of industrialization and the lack of competent government to address the problem of starvation, a communist movement emerges there as well. That communist movement has to fight against the party that Dr. Sun founds. It's a party called the Kuomintang that's not terribly important so much as, I guess it is up there, the Kuomintang. That's less important than the person who leads it, who is General Chiang Kai-shek, who is, again, very much similar to the case of the Russian Civil War, supported by the West and heavily sort of dedicated to aligning China with the West. The Communist Party is led by Chairman Mao Zedong. And this war goes on for 22 years. There is a respite between 1937, when Japan invades China, and 1945, when Japan is defeated, during which time Chiang and Mao agreed to cooperate and get rid of the Japanese. But essentially, the minute the Japanese are gone, they begin fighting each other again. The communists are victorious in this. In 1949, they wipe out the remaining areas of resistance from the Kuomintang, who go into exile on Taiwan, where they've been ever since. And Mao proclaims a People's Republic of China. So the problems that are faced in China are similar to the problems faced in Russia: an overwhelmingly agrarian society, a lack of industrialization, regular issues of poor distribution of resources, particularly food, except that in China these problems are immeasurably worse because there's far more people, there's far less development, and what development there has been created by colonial powers who have retarded development on an economic scale in China for the previous 100 years. So China is in some ways extremely backward. Plus, the Civil War and World War II really leveled the country as well. So the infrastructure, what little infrastructure there had been, is pretty much destroyed. Mao, for his part, like most of our communist revolutionaries, is middle class. He attends college, trains to become a teacher. He moves to Beijing, which is the capital of China, and gets involved in the communist movement there, joins the movement, and eventually rises to its leadership. Between 1949 and 1976, when he dies, he is what is called the paramount leader in China. He is the absolute ruler of the country. There is a ruling party, and there are other people that hold important roles. Of course, there's the army, there's a prime minister, but as chairman of the Communist Party of China, Mao is essentially the absolute ruler of the country. And one of the things that he does that is quite effective in undergirding this rule is he engenders a very large cult of personality. Cults of personality are a major factor of ideological power. If you can elevate the leader of a political movement or a country to the status of almost like a god, and have that person's face be sort of iconically represented throughout your country, for everybody to hang on that person's every word, that endows that particular person with a significant amount of power that doesn't come from things like military power or economic power. Mao probably institutes the biggest cult of personality in the 20th century. Other leaders have them. Hitler has one, Stalin has one, even democratic leaders like Roosevelt have cults of personality. But in China, it's something very different from the other cases. Mao also introduces his own variation on communism. He characterizes himself as a Leninist, so he believes in this idea of a vanguard party. But he acknowledges that China is different from both an historical standpoint in terms of its development, as well as culturally, in terms of being an Asian country rather than a European country. Marx was European, after all, and he observed industrialization in a European context and formulated the solution to the problems of industrialization and capitalism in a European context. And Mao acknowledged that those things likely would not apply perfectly in the context of China. So he introduces a bunch of innovations. The first one, new democracy. He acknowledges China's path to democracy will be different from that in the West. And here he means not that there's going to be free elections or anything like that, but rather that the institution of a more equitable distribution of power. Which means basically a concession right off the bat that the a dictatorship of the proletariat will be much longer lasting because the task that's going to need to be undertaken is going to be much more difficult. The second thing that he institutes during the Civil War is this notion of a people's war. And he says that in order for communist revolutions to win in a society like China, it's necessary for them to adopt guerrilla tactics, for one thing, and to fight mobily. And the big sort of thing that Mao says is necessary is that communist revolutionaries have to operate, he says, like fish swimming in the sea, so that they mill around and mix with the regular population and can be activated within that population at a moment's notice and strike out. So where you see this actually sort of most readily recognizable and in the American imagination is in the Vietnam War. The Viet Cong do this in South Vietnam. In the Vietnam War, the South Vietnam is fighting North Vietnam, but they're also fighting communist revolutions that are operating within South Vietnam, the Viet Cong. And they are carrying out guerrilla warfare actions within the population, but they are not distinguishing themselves in any way from the population. They are in every village, they are in every town, and they can strike out at any moment, and they do. This is a line about guerrilla warfare that essentially comes from Mao. The third thing that he says is called the mass line. The party, he says, in fact, must not be separate from the masses. Which doesn't mean that there should not be a vanguard, but does mean that there should essentially be nobody that is not in some way touched or affiliated with the party. So in most communist countries, membership in the Communist Party is not obligatory. And in fact, it's not in China either. But there is a sort of realization in communist countries that the party runs everything, and therefore anybody of influence or significance is going to be involved in the party. And there will be a necessary separation between people that are involved in the party and those people who are not. And it isn't that their lives will not interact with the party at some point. Clearly they will, because the party is the body that rules everything. But the sort of the day-to-day interaction of the people with the party will be limited. Mao's opinion about this is that that's not good, that there should be a more natural movement back and forth between the general population and members of the party. And in that sense, it lends itself very well to totalitarianism, to the sense of the government's ideology pervading every part of life. So that political ideology is not just a governing philosophy of how things should be done at the central level, but in fact provides things like, your very way of life, and is informed by things like the culture of the country. So it's on this basis that China's form of communism becomes as totalitarian as it does, at least under Mao. So just important points along the way for China. Famously, China intervenes in the Korean War in 1950. North Korea invades South Korea, and then there is the deployment of UN forces to support South Korea, which is quite effective. But then Mao invades North Korea, and the war is fought to a stalemate almost immediately. So probably most famously, Mao launches a program in 1958 called the Great Leap Forward. This is a, hi, you done?
Yes.
Okay, can you put them on the desk? And you guys can either sit for the last, 5-10 minutes, or you can take off, it's up to you. So the Great Leap Forward is a move to collectivize the farming in China, and it goes about as well as collectivization of farming goes everywhere else, which is to say it doesn't go terribly well. For one thing, there is famine, again, breaking out during this process of collectivization. It is as bad as every famine that has happened in China before. In fact, it is essentially so bad that that the policy has to be abandoned, although the farms are largely collectivized by that point. Here's the key thing for understanding what happens in China with the Great Leap Forward and with the collectivization of farms. Nobody can say for sure whether the famine that happened in China during the Great Leap Forward was a result of the Great Leap Forward or was another famine that China would have had every 25 to 40 years. But what can be said conclusively are two things. Number one, certainly Mao's government did not manage the situation to the best of its possibility if 20 million people died. And second of all, although that's about an average for a loss in a Chinese famine, by the way, horrendous as it is. Second of all, it was the last famine that China had. So if there's one success that Mao has to be given, but again, you can accomplish pretty much anything in a communist country because you're not terribly concerned about the individual price that people might pay. They solved the problem of famine in China. It doesn't exist there anymore. Famously, Mao broke with the Soviet Union in 1960 and established his own base of international power, allying with communist countries that broke from the Soviet yoke, as well as beginning to reach out and establish Maoist armies in the developing world, particularly in Africa and Latin America. They acquired nuclear weapons in 1964. Of course, they still have them today. In the mid-60s, Mao made the argument that the people of China had lost their revolutionary vigor, and that therefore the revolution needed to kind of be reinstituted at the grassroots level. And this was called the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, or just the Cultural Revolution, which went on for about 3 years. What he did was he empowered young men, largely unemployed young men, or men who were just out of or on their way into the army, gave them a tremendous amount of power at the local level and advised them to purge reactionary elements from the army at the local level, which went about as well as you can imagine that it would do. To give young men in particular a lot of military power is not usually a great idea. To allow them to operate with very little oversight, also not a great idea. And so widespread persecution on this level, and largely from the hindsight of history viewed as something that was rather cynical on Mao's part. He felt as if his hold over the country was slipping, and felt really that instituting something like the Cultural Revolution would be a good way of reasserting control, which it was. Again, reconfirming our lesson about getting things done in communist countries with the least concern for individual well-being.